Hello, you're listening to the Read Anything Lately podcast. I'm Isaac.
And I'm Jason.
Today, we are recording the second real episode of the show. And as last time I asked Jason what he'd been reading, now we're going to be discussing what I've read in the past couple of weeks.
Come on, I'm supposed to ask you.
Yeah, so ask
All
it.
right. Isaac,
Yeah?
read anything lately?
Well, I'll tell you. So recently, I've read a couple of books, and some of them I don't think are very interesting to talk about. I read Penn and Teller's How to Play with Your Food and Penn and Teller's How to Play in Traffic, but those two books are even more light reading than like a Superman comic book. Those are the lightest books ever discovered. I don't think there's anything interesting to say about them. The two interesting books that I've read.
Why are they titled those things?
Well, so Penn and Teller had released a book called Cruel Tricks for Dear Friends, which is about magic tricks you can play on your friends. And then How to Play with Your Food is a number of tricks that can be performed at meals or with food items. There's one where you give someone a recipe that looks like it makes food, but it actually blows up. It doesn't blow up like a bomb, but like a baking soda volcano.
Yeah.
Most of them are actually like magic tricks. There's one that makes it look like you can bleed from your hands, like the Son of Christ. Well, like Christ himself, I guess. There was no Son of Christ.
Son of God.
Yeah. Unless you read the Da Vinci Code, in which case there's a Son of Christ. But anyway, and then How to Play in Traffic is about tricks to do when you're traveling, tricks on airplanes, tricks on trains, tricks in taxi cabs. But I really don't want to get too much into those books. So what I've really read that was interesting were Crime and Punishment by Fyodor Nikolaevich Dostoevsky and Rose Matter by Stephen King. And I think there's a very interesting dichotomy between these two books. I think they're very different books. I'm somewhat reminded of a John Mulaney bit where he compares something to saying my two favorite foods are lobster and Skittles. Crime and Punishment would be the lobster, and Rose Matter would be the Skittles. Because
that does kind of track just from my knowledge of both books.
Yeah. You know anything about Rose Matter other than what I've told you?
Not really. I mean, other than that, it's kind of comparing a Stephen King book to a work of classic literature. And
right.
There's definitely going to be some discrepancy in kind of the tone and the overall feeling of the book based on both the intentions of both stories and just the era in which they were both made.
Right. So even leaving aside the quality of the two books, and I believe Crime and Punishment to be the far superior book, but even leaving that aside, even assuming they're of the same quality.
Well, I never assumed there was a difference in quality, merely a difference in just tone and like.
Right, so that's more what I want to get into, although I believe Crime and Punishment is a good piece of classic literature and Rose Matter is a fairly crappy thriller. I think that the main thing to really discuss is the difference between sort of the classical work of Crime and Punishment and the more modern sort of lowbrow work of Rose Matter, because I think there's some fundamental differences, and I think one good way to look at it would be, so first I'm going to give you an overview of these books. So Crime and Punishment was written in, I think, 1866 by Fyodor Nikolaevich Dostoevsky, and he was very much the Russian Charles Dickens. He's a very similar writer to Charles Dickens in a lot of ways, and his book, Crime and Punishment, is about a young man named Rodion Romanich Raskolnikov, who commits a murder against a wealthy landlady in 1860s Russia in order to make a large sum of money. And then Rose Matter is, I think, from 1991. It's by Stephen King, and it's about a woman who has been abused by her husband for 14 years, who one day, for no particular reason, suddenly decides to leave and to run away.
Yeah, for no particular reason.
Well, as in, because she didn't leave, there's nothing about that one particular day. It was a day just like the day before it. It was presumably going to be just like the day next to it. But she sees a drop of blood on a bedsheet, and for no reason we ever get explained, that is just the thing that sends her out the door, and she just decides to leave. It's by far not the worst day of their marriage. He's done horrible, horrible things to her before, but somehow just seeing a drop of blood on the bedsheet is what sends her. And I think it's interesting how the two books begin, because Rose Matter opens with a huge pop of completely raw, undisguised emotion and plot. The first scene is when the main character of Rose Matter is a woman named Rosie McClendon Daniels. and she is pregnant, and her husband Norman Daniels has beaten her, and she has just lost the baby in this opening scene. This is the first scene of the book, and it is already completely in the story. In that first scene, in the first couple of sentences, we already have a hero, a villain, a conflict that will carry us to the last word.
So would you say this is like in medias res, or just kind of starting a book?
It's a little unclear to me because on the one hand, I would say it's almost before medias res. It's even before the beginning, because it's before she even leaves the house.
To clarify, in medias res is basically a storytelling convention where the story basically starts in the middle of the action, and then how it started is explained later.
Right. But I would say this is more starting from the beginning, even though it is many years into their marriage. It's not at all it's sort of the first element of the book's conflict that we're seeing at that moment. But when we start Crime and Punishment, we do not already know what the book is about. The book opens on Rodion Raskolnikov as what?
No, I mean, it's like, imagine, did it take you a lot of practicing to be able to say that name correctly?
I actually didn't say it right. It's not Raskolnikov, it's Raskolnikov. But Raskolnikov is in his apartment kind of languishing, and it's the heat of summer. It's blazingly hot outside. He is, and he's just kind of wandering. He's pissed off about his landlady. He's muttering to himself. He's thinking about something he's been planning, but you don't know what it is. And in these opening words, you do not know who the hero is. You do not know who the villain is. You do not know what the book is about.
All you know is that it's hot.
Yeah, you know it's hot. You know it's August. You know it's Russia. You know it's the 1800s. But Dostoevsky spends about 150 pages, about a quarter of his book, just painting the background for his story to begin. There's a sense of patience in Crime and Punishment which does not come across in Rose Matter. Rose Matter is, right now, we're going to start the story right here. Here's the hero, here's the villain, now we're going to start. Pedal to the metal, here we go. Whereas Crime and Punishment is much slower, it's much more patient, it's much more paced.
Would you say it's, like, boring? Or would you say it's paced in, like, an interesting way that just takes its time?
I would say quite a lot of Crime and Punishment is boring, but not, especially once you get over that 150-page hump, because at the end of 150 pages, Raskolnikov does kill the landlady, whose name escapes me at the moment, but he kills her, and then the story is kind of pushed into higher gear. There are still long gaps, but almost everything that happens after that point is interesting. And Rose Matter, it does also build, but Rose Matter cannot build the whole way because of how quickly it guns its engines at the start. It's going 120 miles per hour right out of the gate. And so it almost follows a push and pull of energy, where the book starts fast and then it kind of slows down. Once Rosie McClendon is out of her house and away from her husband, and there's a gap, there's an 800-mile gap, she's now in another big city far away from him, then the story, it pulls back, it slows down. Now she's making friends in the city, she's finding a coffee shop she likes, she buys a painting, and then, you know, we cut back to Norman, and now we're ratcheting up the speed. Now it's going to 90, now it's 100, now 120, but then it goes back and it's calm, and it's like a tide going in and out. But because Crime and Punishment begins so slow and builds so slowly, the book is able to build its tension constantly throughout.
Mm-hmm. So one is like, you know, so kind of Rose Matter is like, you know, the ebb and flow, like the tide of the ocean, whereas Crime and Punishment is like a gathering storm.
Yeah, there is a feeling of and in a lot of old books, there's kind of a feeling of, because, well, less than in a lot of old books. You remember we read Tale of Two Cities.
Yes. Tale
of Two Cities ultimately culminates in a single event. Mm-hmm. There's a single big event which culminates the entire book. Crime and Punishment has maybe got a half dozen events which tie up different plots. So there's one big event, one big thing that's built to with Svidrigailov, and another thing that's built to with Raskolnikov, and there's another thing that they spend the book building up to, well, maybe just those two, but there's a couple other characters who have kind of, there's a big scene for Pyotr Petrovich Luzhin, he also gets his own climax. The book is building to a number of climaxes, but they're a cluster bomb. It's a cluster bomb of an ending. And that's actually another thing I want to get to. Rose Matter, although it has different viewpoints, has got only one plot. The story is exclusively a conflict between Rosie McClendon and Norman Daniels, whereas the Crime and Punishment has a number of characters and a number of interactions and a number of plots. I think there's it's not just an issue of length, because not of course, but Crime and Punishment is the longer book by probably a factor of half again. But Crime and Punishment is also denser. It's more complex. There's more going on in the book. There's also, as a point I want to get to, an interesting point about, and something I thought was tiresome about Rose Matter, something that I did not like about it, which is that Norman Daniels is the simplest and most unsympathetic and most uncomplicated villain in the history of fiction writing.
Well, I mean, it's kind of hard to feel bad for a guy who abuses his wife, and has done so for like 11 years.
I don't know. I think that's an issue of imagination. I mean, Stephen King comes close at a number of points to making us feel for Norman Daniels, and never complexly, never in an interesting way, because it's not a very good book. The closest he comes is to having us learn that Norman himself was beaten and molested as a child, and he mentions that in passing, but somehow manages, even through conveying that information, to just make us feel nothing. I mean, I don't even mean that I don't sympathize with him, which is bad enough. I don't even hate him. He's a completely flat, uninteresting, not emotionally provocative character. He's not disgustingly cold or disgustingly human. He doesn't seem like someone you could become. He doesn't seem like somebody who could hurt you. He doesn't seem like someone who could really exist.
Yeah.
I mean, we were talking last week about Dracula, who is very much a pure evil villain. But in Dracula, Dracula is not the point. Well, we'll say what you're going to say.
I was going to say, kind of like how we were discussing, kind of last session. Like, you could call somebody a vampire and have it mean something. Like, Dracula, though he is a pure evil villain and he is a literal monster, and he is kind of figuratively and literally demonic in nature, but you could meet a guy like that, like the super manipulative, cold, calculating, scheming guy who puts on a face of cordiality and just being a genuinely good and hospitable person, but then kind of as the layers peel back, you discover just how truly vile and unrepentant of a person they are. But with this villain you're describing, there's none of that.
Right. Even the cruelest real world domestic abuser is simply nothing like Norman Daniels, to my knowledge. He is not a human. He is not a person who has been written to have human qualities. He is a story-serving automaton. Mm-hmm. He is a robot whose constructed function is to beat Rosie McClendon. He does not have character, and you can see points where Stephen King has tried to give him character and has failed, given him specific attributes or specific habits which somehow just completely fail in deepening his character.
So, to my knowledge, and maybe I'm just not as well versed in his books as I probably should be.
You don't have to read any Stephen King. I mean, he's not a book for a literature student to read.
I guess
he's a writer to read for pleasure.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I was gonna say that typically in Stephen King's books, to my knowledge, there's kind of some supernatural twists. Does this book have that?
Yes. So this book does have a supernatural twist.
Would that spoil it for anyone who wants to read it?
I think I can skirt the edges of it. I won't go fully into the supernatural events that occur in the book, but much like Norman Daniels, they are very uninspired. Stephen King has a fantastic book. Well, actually, I'm not going to spoil that one by even saying what its name is. I'll recommend it in another episode. Mm-hmm. But he's got, I'll tell you one book. He has got a very good book called Salem's Lot, where the supernatural element is vampires, what we were discussing last week. Mm-hmm. And At no point does he make vampires seem like a silly thing to put in a serious book. He manages to make them so cold and so threatening and so realistic that at no point are you reading and going, this is a load of crap. This is some schlock pulp nonsense. But, so Rose Matter's main supernatural element happens when Rosie McClendon walks into an antique shop and buys a painting of a woman standing on a hill wearing a robe, looking into the horizon.
Is it going to be like a Dorian Gray situation?
Maybe. It's a little unclear. Having finished the book, I can honestly tell you, not even trying to withhold or give spoilers, I couldn't tell you if it's a Dorian Gray situation or not. But when she buys this painting, she looks in the back, and this is where the title of the book comes from. The title of the painting is Rose Madder, which is also a color. And the painting reveals itself to have some strange properties on Rosie McClendon's psyche. But this element feels it feels stupid in a way that Salem's Lot's vampires do not. This painting feels, because the story has got a number of fairly interesting elements of human drama. I've said it's uninspired, but although Norman Daniels is an uninspired villain, Rosie McClendon is a fine hero, and her emotions toward Norman, while almost entirely negative, are still pretty complex and can make for some pretty interesting reading. And there's some interesting plots where Rosie McClendon falls in love, makes some friends. There's some interesting human drama and human emotion in the story. But the painting, rather than blending with it as the vampires do in Salem's Lot, in Rose Madder there is a harsh discord. The painting feels in violation of the human drama and the human element of the story.
It's kind of like, Stephen King is contractually obligated to put supernatural aspects into every one of his stories, and he's like, I don't know, she finds a painting or something.
Yeah.
Like, I don't know, man, just give me my paycheck already. Like, it doesn't feel that inspired, right? Like, it kind of feels like it's forced in there because it almost like it has to be there when it really doesn't.
Right. And I'd elaborate on that a little, because the primary human drama of the story, the thing that I thought was most interesting, is that Rosie McClendon is a little bit of an instance of once bitten, twice shy, where once she's had this terrible relationship with her husband, she doesn't really trust anything, even very trustworthy things and people. And so a lot of the book is her becoming comfortable making friends, becoming comfortable falling in love, becoming comfortable having a job, living alone, and sort of overcoming her fears. But the painting kind of circumvents this interesting part of the plot, because for reasons that become elaborated on throughout the story, whenever Rosie McClendon thinks about the painting, her fears go away. So what could be a very interesting story with a number of interesting internal conflicts almost becomes the equivalent, the book writing equivalent of button mashing, where every time Rosie McClendon comes to an uncomfortable situation, all she has to do is think about the painting, and then she wins. She overcomes her fears.
It's kind of like character development in a painting.
Right. It's replacing character development with a painting. It's kind of ripping out the guts and the heart of the story and replacing it with a piece of paper.
Well, more like a piece of parchment.
Well, it's an oil painting. I don't know what it's on.
On a canvas, I guess?
Yeah, I guess it's replacing it with a piece of canvas. And Crime and Punishment, because I do want to get to the better of these two books. So there are many evil characters in Crime and Punishment, and there's one who's even pretty parallel to Norman Daniels, Arkady Ivanovich Svidrigailov, who is, similarly, he is pure evil, and similarly, he is boring. While we hear about him doing a number of truly evil things, he is said to have raped and killed a 15-year-old girl, and to have so tormented and bullied his manservant over the course of years that the manservant killed himself. Even though he is said to be this incredibly cold, evil character in the story, at no point in the plot do we see him do almost anything. It is almost all...
Show, don't tell. Wait,
yeah,
tell, don't show.
Yeah.
Tell, don't show. show don't tell is a good thing.
Yeah.
Tell don't show is a bad and boring thing.
Yeah, everything done by Svidrigailov is reported to us second or third or fourth hand as rumors. There are a couple of moments with him that are genuinely chilling, but overall, although I think he is intended as the book's primary villain, I did not find him very intriguing.
Well, like, who is he?
So, Svidrigailov is a fairly wealthy man who is living away. So the story is mostly set in St. Petersburg. I'm not actually sure if you do Russianify Petersburg. I always did when I was reading the book as St. Petersburg, but I think maybe I should just say St. Petersburg. I think there's only a certain extent you can go to with this kind of Russian accented thing.
Yeah.
The story is mostly set in St. Petersburg, and he is living in the countryside away from the city with his wealthy wife. He has married into a great deal of wealth, and his family has hired a governess to look after the house and the children. And the governess is Avdotia Romanova Raskolnikova, who is sister to Rodion Raskolnikov, our main character. And he becomes attracted to her and advances upon her, and she rejects his advances. And I don't know if she's fired or if she quits. I believe Svidrigailov's wife fires her. And so that is how we come to know him and come to hear of him for the first time. And actually, I'm glad then you got me onto the subject of Avdotia Romanova, because she also interacts with the book's other main villain, and I think he is a much more interesting character. So shortly after leaving Svidrigailov's employ, Avdotia Romanova becomes engaged to be married with a lawyer of some fairly good wealth named Pyotr Petrovich Lushin, or Lushin. It's either Lushin or Lushin, I'm not sure. And Pyotr Petrovich is a much subtler villain. If you can think of Svidrigailov and Norman Daniels as like a bowl of Skittles or a donut, kind of a simple carb villain. Pyotr Petrovich is much more like a loaf of bread. He's a complex carb villain. He takes a long time to digest. When we meet him...
Yeah, you have to compare every single character in this book to a piece of food now.
Alright, so Raskolnikov is a churro, and because he has both complex and simple carbs. And Pulcheria Marmeladova is the left claw of a lobster. So Lushin, when we meet him, we do not know if he is a villain. We suspect, because Raskolnikov suspects. We hear that Avdotia Romanova is marrying this wealthy man, and Raskolnikov theorizes, and we do not know yet if he is right, that Avdotia Romanova has felt pressured into marrying this man because Raskolnikov is unemployed, and their father is dead, and the family is lacking money. And so Avdotia Romanova thinks, if I marry rich, we'll be saved. And we find out that not only is he right, but Pyotr Petrovich knows that too. And so Pyotr Petrovich thinks, I am a wealthy man. This family has no other source of income. They rely on me. I can do whatever I want.
Uh-oh.
And that is the central villainy of Pyotr Petrovich. Although, again, what makes him such an interesting and complicated villain is we don't know how right Raskolnikov is at first. We develop an understanding of his villainy. When we first meet him, at least when I first met him, I kind of thought Raskolnikov was crazy. I thought Raskolnikov is crazy. He's a disillusioned, over-philosophizing, over-intellectual, overthinking, self-centered nut who believes that his sister's fiancé or fiancée, I've never remembered which is masculine and which is feminine, must be evil.
And isn't Raskolnikov, isn't he only like 20 or something?
Raskolnikov is, I think, about 23, and Avdotia is about 20.
Yeah. So it's kind of like, this young man who thinks he's smart, he thinks he's hot stuff, and I mean, I guess so he's almost like a conspiracy theorist, kind of from what you're saying.
Yeah, he's very much like a conspiracy theorist.
Except he ends up being right. Well,
he ends up being right about Pyotr Petrovic. He ends up being completely right about Pyotr Petrovic. There are other things he ends up being wrong about. The main thing he ends up being wrong about is he has a sort of Nietzschean philosophy. When he was in college, he wrote a tract which said that there are some people who are chosen by destiny to advance humanity to a better position. And he most commonly mentions Napoleon, but also people like Alexander the Great, people like George Washington, people who put their hand into the river of history. They change its course. And he believes that those people have the right to do whatever is necessary to make the changes they want.
So very Hobbesian.
Hobbesian?
Like Thomas Hobbes. Like kind of the whole thing of like Thomas Hobbes, he was like an English philosopher, sociologist, who basically said like there are certain people who should have absolute power over society, and like no one should be allowed to question them or go against them, because it is only those men who are kind of destined to have this kind of power that can effectively lead society. And without them, if lesser people try to take control, society will collapse. It'll all fall apart. I'm probably not describing it in its full complexity, but this kind of does sound like something Mr. Thomas Hobbes would say.
If that is indeed Thomas Hobbes' philosophy, then that is very much in line with Raskolnikov's thinking. He's a little bit less on the society level, a little bit more on the fate level. He doesn't so much care if society agrees with him or supports him. He just thinks that as a matter of course and as a matter of logic, these people, everything should turn out all right for them, and that fate and the universe has decreed that whatever they do is morally okay.
Do you think Raskolnikov would favor Reddit or 4chan?
I think he's more of a 4chan guy, but he does improve as the story goes on. That's the that is almost the punishment of the Crime and Punishment. Although it's I think a better title might be Crime and Redemption. But so he has this philosophy, this sort of deluded philosophy, and so he makes a decision. He says, "My family is in poverty. I am unemployed. We are starving. I often go 2 or 3 days without eating. We do not have a home. We are clinging to this wealthy, cruel, heartless man, begging for scraps of bread from his pocket. And he knows there is a wealthy landlady in town, a very wealthy woman, an old woman, who is cruel, hateful, awful to everyone around her.
And would not be missed.
Would not be grieved. I think he calls her a despicable, harmful old louse. He describes her as a vermin, as a parasite. And he says, what good does she do the world? And what good does she do the world by having all that money? And so he finds out when her lady's maid, Lizaveta, is going to be out. And he goes to her house with an axe, and he loses his nerve. And then, or rather, the first time, I think, Lizaveta is there, but then he, through providence, discovers that there's a time when Lizaveta's not going to be there. This time, there's no chance to lose his nerve. He goes in, kills her with the axe. Lizaveta comes back. He kills her with the axe. And this is kind of a flaw in his plan, because there was nothing at all. Lizaveta is completely blameless. And then he's kind of in a panic. He's kind of in a whirlwind. He doesn't know what to do. He steals a couple of trinkets and trifles, but he leaves the 1,500 ruble strongbox completely untouched. And by pure luck, he manages to run away and escape. And so, about that matter, he is wrong. He is deluded. He is deluded even within his own theory. Because while you can argue from without the theory, you can say there's nobody above morality. Even from within his theory, he ends up admitting that he cannot be one of those great men, because he thinks he questioned if he was a great man. He didn't know, and as soon as he didn't know, he should have known that he wasn't. Because by his logic,
great men know.
Great men know. And so he ends up kind of beating himself up for the wrong reason for a lot of the story. And Dostoevsky's very smart. He knows it's the wrong reason. He himself did not believe in Raskolnikov's philosophy. but we have Raskolnikov first kind of failing to realize where he has gone wrong. He spends a lot of the story beating himself up for having presumed himself to be a great man, rather than for having presumed that anyone could be above morality.
I don't know. I'd be beating myself up over killing an innocent woman.
Right. So that is sort of. Eventually, without getting too much into spoilers, that does end up becoming the book. Advances through stages of morality, but so this is the kind of, as I said, the sort of complex carbs that you don't get with Norman Daniels. Raskolnikov is the book's principal and viewpoint character. And at many points in the story, he is the hero. He does great, heroic, beneficial, kind things. Even though he has done this horrible crime, he has killed this old woman who, we may accept his argument that she is pestilent and parasitic. It is still not right to kill her with an axe.
Or kill her at all.
Well, yeah, but...
yes.
I didn't mean that it would be right to kill her with poison.
Well, I don't know.
By saying that it was wrong to kill her with an axe.
You specified the axe part. I didn't know if that's what you meant.
And it is certainly... there was nothing parasitic or pestilent about Lizaveta. And I think that is also kind of a theme of the book, is the unintended consequence, that he thinks, oh, what's wrong? I'm killing a woman who does strictly harm to other people, but he causes collateral damage. As soon as he kills one person, there's a witness, and now he has to kill another. Sort of the unforeseen consequences of breaking your moral principles. But this is what I mean by a complex villain. Raskolnikov is, we may even say, especially by the end of the book, that he is a hero. But he has done these horrible things, these horrible, horrible crimes. And Pyotr Petrovich is a horrible, cruel man, but he's never killed an innocent woman. And Pyotr Petrovich is not purely evil himself. He does some horrible things, the things I mentioned, but he also does other horrible things to other people for his own benefit. But there are flaws in the gem, or anti-flaws in the anti-gem. There are diamonds in the trash. There are little moments where he says something insightful, or he does something kind. Because Dostoevsky understood human nature in that book a lot better than Stephen King did in Rose Matter.
I mean, I do think it's kind of an interesting question. Like, is it more evil to do one really bad thing, or a bunch of kind of bad things? Well, actually, I mean, I would argue, raping and killing a 15-year-old girl is a really evil thing.
Yeah, I mean, but that's Svidrigailov, who
yeah.
I said he is not an interesting villain.
Oh, okay.
He is also a simple carbs kind of villain.
Mm-hmm.
But Pyotr Petrovich is a much more interesting, much more complex carbs villain, and I think... Go on.
No, I mean, kind of from what you've said, it's like, he's not like a, sprouting devil horns and, like, he doesn't sound like a truly evil man, just powerful and manipulative.
Yes, and he's also deluded, like what Raskolnikov was. Raskolnikov is deluded by philosophy. He believes he has argued himself into a philosophical and logical position from which he is allowed to commit murder. Luzhin, Pyotr Petrovich, so part of understanding this book is that Russians have got 3 names. Mm-hmm. Their middle name is just as much a part of their name as their first and last, unlike Americans. Mm-hmm. And there are some characters who are sometimes referred to by their first 2 names and sometimes by their last. Pyotr Petrovich Luzhin is one of these characters. So sometimes he's called Pyotr Petrovich and sometimes he's called Luzhin. And you have to realize they're talking about the same guy.
So wait, is Luzhin, is that his middle name or his last name? Or...
So Pyotr means his name is Peter.
Yeah.
Petrovich means he is the son of Pyotr, and Luzhin is his surname. Another example of that would be Rodion, his name's Rodion, Romanich, son of Roman, Raskolnikov, of the Raskolnikov family. Mm-hmm. And then, for instance, Avdotia Romanova Raskolnikova is Avdotia, daughter of Roman, of the Raskolnikov family, with the because she's female. Mm-hmm. And so I fall into the sort of pattern. I call him, just as the book does, I call him mostly Pyotr Petrovich when I'm talking about his relation to members of the family, and mostly Luzhin when referring to him in the abstract. Mm-hmm. So Pyotr Petrovich, he is also a deluded man. But not by philosophy, more by instinct. He has sort of all his life had the vision and the ideal of a loving wife and family, a devoted wife and family, just like a vision in his head ever since he was young. And he cannot quite realize that is not what has happened. He can't. He has failed to. He has failed to realize that his situation is an economic one. As soon as Avdotia Romanova sort of attaches herself to him, he realizes that he has power over her, but he assumes that because he has power over her and because she is submissive to him, that therefore she must be the devoted wife he has been looking for. Because he wants a devoted wife so badly, he doesn't allow himself to understand that the reason she is so devoted is because he has power over her.
So both the primary protagonist and the primary antagonist both kind of suffer from these sorts of delusions. The difference is that the protagonist grows from those and the antagonist does not.
Yes, that is very much one of the ideas behind Crime and Punishment, is that Pyotr Petrovich Lushin finds himself simply incapable of growth. There's a scene where he experiences a defeat. I won't go into a great deal of detail about it because I do think this is a fantastic book, and I don't want to spoil it, but there is a scene where he suffers a defeat. And it is mentioned as he is leaving the scene of the crime, but the scene of the event. Three things. One, that up until the moment it happened, up until the very moment he lost, it had never crossed his mind that he could lose. He had not even considered it. So that's an example already of being unwilling to grow and unwilling to change. He does not consider where he might go wrong and try to prevent it. He can only think of things going well and how to achieve them. And then the second thing that is mentioned is that he's leaving the scene of the of his defeat, and he is thinking, this is all gonna blow over. He thinks like this is like we reading the scene know that the blow that has been struck against him, what he has just lost, it is a telling blow. It is a final loss. What has just happened to him, the thing he has just lost, he is never going to get back. The best thing for him to do right now would be to forget about it and move on. He has lost. But we see into his mind and realize that he doesn't know that. He thinks this is a setback. It's a frustrating setback. This is going to blow over in a couple of days, and then everything's going to be back where it was. Whereas when Raskolnikov has killed the old woman, he does not allow himself to accept the idea that nothing has happened. It is with him always. It is always on his mind. This has happened. It is done. I must move on. I must react to what is happening in the now.
So it's kind of interesting, and actually, I was gonna say I see this in stories like all the time. It's almost like a universal constant. Not always. I guess that wouldn't make it universal, but it's darn near a universal constant where the hero changes and the villain does not.
Right.
The villain can change, and the villain can even like redeem themselves, but then they're not a villain anymore. Like a true villain who remains evil to the end does not change their ways. They might adapt, they might shift their worldview a little, but in the end they're still stuck in their ways. But it's almost always the hero. Even if they start off the story as like either a villain or an anti-hero or just someone who's misguided and flawed, but it's almost like they almost always like end up by the story changing for the better, and that's how they win. Kind of like in the comic series, also now a movie, also now a TV show, Scott Pilgrim.
Oh yes.
Of the World.
Yes.
That is one of the, I think in my eyes, one of the best. The story has its flaws, but it's a really good example of a genuinely, not even like a bad person,
right?
Not a villain, not an evil person, just a bad, flawed person becoming better.
I think you're a little loud for the levels. The level to go a little.
But it's the story of this flawed person, not an evil person, just a flawed person becoming better both by their own actions and by the help of those around them.
In fact, I would say that Scott Pilgrim as a character so closely mirrors Raskolnikov that I would say that's almost a perfect analogy. Scott Pilgrim starts the story as a truly despicable like he's likable and funny in certain kind of amusing ways, but to actually know him as a person, he is a deeply manipulative, disgusting, repulsive little worm.
And everyone hates him.
Everyone hates him because he really is. He sucks. He's 23 years old. He's unemployed. He's dating a high schooler. He's still not over his old girlfriend who dumped him over a year ago. Not only does he have a high school girlfriend, he's not even nice to her within the oeuvre of her being his high school girlfriend. He's cold and manipulative and distant and dismissive toward her.
And the thing about him is, like, he's not, like... He doesn't even come off as, like, a bad... He just comes off as, like, a guy you could meet. Like, he seems so normal and placid, and, like, you know, you look at his blank eyes and his blank face, and you don't see much, but, like, there's just a deeply flawed person who, honestly, does he even really realize it?
I think if you were to look into the mind of Scott Pilgrim, you would see that very faintly in the corner, under a heap of laundry, the most intense possible alarm was blaring and flashing red lights, and he is trying to ignore it. I think, like Raskolnikov, because Raskolnikov, even before he has killed the woman, but especially after, he realizes, oh man, I should not have done that. And at first he doesn't let himself realize, but some part of him knows immediately. It festers, and it preys upon him, and it grows, and it colonizes his brain, and Scott Pilgrim is much like that, although because Scott Pilgrim is a lighter story, it happens faster and is a little bit less the focus. But still, you probably click cancel on that. Right. It's probably not a big deal, but but Scott Pilgrim, like Raskolnikov, on some level understands that what he is doing is wrong. It's just that it takes, in fact, in both stories, it is so tropically the love of a good woman.
Yeah.
In the case of Scott Pilgrim, I would say it's done a little better because it's done a little more recently.
I don't know if I'd call it, in Scott Pilgrim's case, love of a good woman or just love of a woman who's just as flawed as him, but they at least help each other realize it.
She's less flawed.
Well, she's less flawed, but she's still flawed.
Yeah. I'll tell you. So there's one very big. I think I've hit every big character in Crime and Punishment except one, and that character is Sofia Semyonich Marmeladova. So Sofia Marmeladova is the daughter of Semyon Zakharovich Marmeladov, and Marmeladov is a man we first meet when Raskolnikov is considering killing the two women. He hasn't done it yet. And he goes to the bar and he meets Marmeladov. And Marmeladov is one of the most... I was calling Scott Pilgrim a disgusting, despicable little worm. Scott Pilgrim is the king of the archangels in heaven compared to Semyon Zakharovich Marmeladov. Marmeladov is a drunk. He is a police officer, technically.
A drunk police officer.
He does not do any stereotypical police officer wrongdoings. In fact, as far as we can tell, he doesn't do work at all. He is an alcoholic. I think he has the job because of like a favor from his brother-in-law or something, but he's useless. He does not show up to work. He gets fired. He begs to be given his job back.
He doesn't do it well.
He gets back. He works for 3 days. He quits. When he gets his first paycheck, his family is so excited, and then he takes almost all of it and blows it on liquor because he's a drunk. And his family becomes so desperate for money that his daughter, Sofia Semyonich Marmeladov, becomes a prostitute. And she becomes the primary income earner of the family. And we hear him talking in the bar along the lines of like, he's talking to Raskolnikov, kind of ranting to him, and he's like, the horrible thing is, I understand how terrible and wrong all this is, and I'm gonna keep drinking anyway.
Because it's too late now. Why bother changing?
Right. He says, and it's not, but he thinks that.
Yeah.
And he, in one of the most painful scenes in the history of literature that we do not actually see, That is to say, there are much more painful scenes that we do see, but this one happens off screen. He recounts to Raskolnikov how at one point he was so desperate for liquor that he went to his daughter's house and begged her for prostitution money so that he could go and drink again. And so he is just this despicable, low down character. He talks about how he doesn't even enjoy drinking anymore. He says he doesn't drink to feel good, he drinks to feel bad. And he is so deep in the hole. He is a worthless kind of person.
Does he ever change?
He does not ever change. As he is walking down the street, he is hit by a carriage, he is run over, and he dies. But at that point, Raskolnikov is present because he is the one who identifies the body. When this old drunk in a police officer's uniform is run over by a cart, people are gathering around the body and they're saying, "What happened? Who is this?" And Raskolnikov comes up and he goes, "Oh, I know this guy. This is Semyon Marmeladov," because he talked to him earlier in the bar. And he feels a little bit of an obligation to this guy just because he spoke to him, so he's kind of the one who sends for the doctor and the priest. Mm-hmm. And when Marmeladov dies, this is what begins to redeem Raskolnikov. So if I may hit the ball back into Scott Pilgrim's court.
Wait, I also just realized they're the same age.
Yeah, they're both 23 years old, or nearly.
I guess that's the age that everyone's lives falls apart. I don't know.
But Scott Pilgrim, so he begins to change when he begins to, as we all grow up, because mm-hmm. Scott Pilgrim is sort of a metaphor for growing up, mm-hmm. When he begins to take on responsibility.
It's almost like his last name is a word for someone who goes on a journey.
Yeah, and it's almost as if he begins dating a girl whose name is a symbol of rebirth.
Ramona Flowers.
Right, Ramona Flowers.
Yeah.
New life springing from death, Flowers. And the villain's name is Graves.
There are like 7.
Gideon Gordon Graves.
No, I know, but like there are like 6 other.
But he's the biggest villain.
Yeah.
So death, rebirth, and the journey between. Scott Pilgrim is a modern literary masterpiece. I'm not joking.
No, I mean, I'm agreeing with you. Yeah. I like it.
And so much as many stories go, as soon as Raskolnikov begins to take on responsibility, that is when he begins to change. And in this case, he sees this family. There's a mother, Semyon Zakarich's wife, whose name is, I believe, Katerina Ivanova Marmeladova, I think. But whatever her name, she is also kind of worthless. She's not as worthless as Marmeladov, but she's crazy. She's out of her mind, particularly when her husband dies. Mm-hmm. She has gone completely mentally off the deep end, which means that Sofia Marmeladova, and there's many small children in the family. I think they range from about 3 to about 10, but none of them can really help out. The only really responsible, intelligent, adult person in the family is Sofia Marmeladov, the prostitute daughter of Semyon Marmeladov. And so as Marmeladov literally gives his last gasp as he dies, being given the last rites, Raskolnikov looks on this family, which is kind of in disrepair, and just as he felt some responsibility for Marmeladov, he feels responsibility for these people, and he begins to try to help them, and that is how he starts to redeem himself and become more of a hero.
And this is like, so when is this in the book?
I think this would be around, it's somewhere near the middle is when Marmeladov is struck and killed. So there's not much more to say. I bet this episode will end before it reaches an hour. Maybe it'll go a little past an hour, is what I'm thinking. But there's another thing to say on the grounds of villains never change, because Raskolnikov. So at the time when Raskolnikov lived, it was not just considered unpleasant to have to turn to prostitution to keep your family alive. It would be considered
like a cardinal sin.
A venal sin. It's a venal sin. But I think, but it is. Although it is not the opinion of Dostoevsky, you can tell reading the book that it is not the opinion of Fyodor Nikolaevich Dostoevsky. It is definitely the opinion of some characters that there must be some weakness of moral fiber for Sofia Semyonova to have turned to prostitution. But
It's frankly for the 1860s, it's kind of an enlightened idea for like sometimes we do wrong things for the right reasons.
yeah, and it's not even, it's not so much morally wrong. It's just unpleasant. I mean,
It's unpleasant.
it's unpleasant for her,
Mhm.
and so
Well,
you
yeah.
might say there's a moral wrong that that has been inflicted on her in some way.
I mean, the moral wrong is that, she is subjecting herself to this bad situation.
Right. And so, there are characters in the story, chiefly Pyotr Petrovich Luzhin, who have only cold feelings for Sofia Semyonova. And so, here's a case of sort of hero's change, because when Raskolnikov he sees Marmeladov die, he hears Marmeladov's wife lament that there won't be enough money for a funeral. And when he hears that, he's got 25 rubles in his pocket. I don't remember why. It's some basically throwaway reason that he's got 25 rubles in his pocket. And when he hears this, he kind of looks at Sofia Semyonova, who's like, because everything in that house happens because Sofia Semyonova pays for it. And so he thinks, like, this is kind of a disaster, that they don't even have enough money to bury this guy, much less to eat the next day. And it's like, are they going to have to go into debt to pay for this funeral? And so on impulse, he takes the 25 rubles and he gives it to Sofia Semyonova. And Pyotr Petrovich sees this. And by this point, he hates Raskolnikov, because he knows that Raskolnikov knows that he, Pyotr Petrovich, is just sort of preying on his family.
Yeah.
So he writes a letter to the rest of the Raskolnikovs saying, I saw your son
Giving money to a prostitute.
giving money to a woman of ill reputation in
broad daylight.
Right, in an apartment in the slums. And this is a case of sort of, because Raskolnikov is kind of overcoming the mores of his time. He is thinking this woman may be a prostitute, but she's essentially a poor, virtuous woman in dire straits who is trying to do whatever she can to keep her family together.
And I think that's also, like, I don't know, just a bit progressive to have, like, the woman of the family being the one who's, like, trying to keep everything together and just being kind of a strong driving force.
But then Pyotr Petrovich does not overcome the feelings of his time. Pyotr Petrovich just thinks, oh, this woman's a prostitute, and the fact that she's a prostitute and the fact that that's wrong means that now I can seize some advantage in this situation. Raskolnikov sees this tragic scene, the scene of the only other person in the family who even might earn them some money, this tragedy of this family torn apart, and it changes something in him. He feels something in his heart, and it changes him for the better. But all Pyotr Petrovich sees when he sees this tragedy is something more for him to grab, more power, more money, more advantage for himself and nobody else.
Does he understand the context? Does he understand that, like, the woman and her family are relatives of the guy who just died?
I believe he does. I believe he knows that, and he decides anyway to present the situation as poorly as possible.
And I think that is, like, that's honestly that is something I would label as truly evil. Like,
yeah.
Basically punishing someone for doing the right thing just so you can, get a leg up over them. Like, I feel like a lot of this story, kind of from what you've described to me, it's like, one of the main themes of the story is, like, kind of like I was talking about earlier, but do the ends, justify the means?
Yeah.
Like, should, I know you said his name like 20 times, but I keep forgetting the name of the main character.
Raskolnikov.
Like, Raskolnikov, does him killing that woman, is it the right thing to do? Like, will the result be for the better? And, like, should Raskolnikov's sister marry this guy to, like, it's a bad thing to marry this guy because, it's obvious he's just going to prey on the family and manipulate them.
And it's wrong to give him what he wants.
Yeah, but also, in return, he'll give them what they want. He'll give them, like, money. He'll give them, food and stuff. And I feel like, from what you described, a lot of this book, the main theme is, like, doesn't matter what we, like, is what we do what matters more? Or, does what comes out of it matter more?
I think that's definitely a very major theme, if not the main theme of the book, is this idea of ends and means.
Crime and punishment.
Yeah, well, so I think Crime and Punishment, I actually do not understand why that is the title of the book. Crime, a major part of the book. Punishment, not so much.
Well, maybe the punishment is being moral and self-aware enough to realize the wrong you've done. Like, the punishment is just the guilt and the pain you feel from this bad thing you did, and your punishment is more like penance. Like, you are redeeming yourself, and your punishment is that in order for you to continue functioning, you have to be better. Like,
right.
you are not ignorant and egotistical enough to just brush this off, assume it'll all blow over and that it's not a problem. Your punishment is that you know exactly what you did, and you will not be able to live with yourself if you do not fix it.
Right.
That is your punishment.
I think, and there's, I think, a very interesting question to discuss between two people who had read the book. Unfortunately, we can't do that because Jason has not read the book, but I think
guys.
Well, no, I mean, it's how the podcast works. But I think a very interesting discussion question, and possibly what I'd ask a class, that if I was like an English teacher and I'd assigned this book to a class and they had read it, I would say, do Raskolnikov's good actions outweigh his bad ones by the end of the story? Because I think whichever side of the line you fall on, I think it's close. I think it's a very close run either way.
I will say there is a story that I do intend on talking about in a future episode of the show that does kind of like one major there is a character who does, like, in the story, something so bad, something so awful that, like, you don't even know if they can actually recover from it. But the fact that they want to, and the fact that they want to try anyway, is like, I don't know, it's like one of the main questions. It's like, does the wrong, like, how much right balances out the wrong?
What, is that a story I've heard of?
Yes, it is. It's
which one?
Order of the Stick.
Oh, which character? Belkar?
Vesuvius.
Oh, yes, Vesuvius, yes.
We'll discuss that. Well, I want to discuss that in another episode, so we'll go more in depth.
Yeah, but that is another very interesting part of it. Another very interesting sort of a literary connection.
And maybe we can, when we discuss it in another episode, we can kind of like tie that story back to this if we want to like draw further connections. I don't know.
Yeah. But it is definitely true that Raskolnikov does some fantastic things. Mm-hmm. I'd like to get back to your idea of this story representing the ends justifying, or the ends having some sort of effect on the means, justifying or not, because I touched on this earlier, but I think it's a really important point, that when Raskolnikov sets out to kill the wicked old landlady, he's thinking of it in terms of a mathematical equation. He thinks, the world minus one villain, me plus several thousand rubles, and he sees that the equation balances out. Perhaps the very small evil of killing a parasitic and terrible old woman, and the very large good of his family living in wealth.
Trade offer. I give you act the skull. You give me several thousand rubles.
And so he fails to consider sort of the real complexities of the situation. The fact that he's not just subtracting a numeral and adding a numeral to the world, because when he kills her, he does not account for the fact that Lizaveta is about to come home. And when she does come home and becomes a witness to his crime, he kills her. And as I mentioned, she hasn't done anything wrong. And so suddenly, we have this idea that the means are messy. That even if your intended ends really do cancel out your intended means, you never know exactly what you're going to do or exactly what you're going to get. Because the world is a complex place, and once you commit one murder, it's kind of hard to stop.
I honestly think this story would have been a lot less interesting if he had committed this murder and kept going. Like, if he had just kind of further descended into darkness and depravity. I think it's a far more interesting turn of events that, like, he realized what he did, and now the story is about him trying to be better instead of just him being worse.
Definitely. Watching him rise out of the pit is one of the most compelling parts of the story. About the murders, I'm reminded, have you ever heard this little rhyming couplet? I wish I could remember who it was by so I could credit it, but whoever wrote it is probably dead by now. Oh, what a tangled web we weave when first we practice to deceive. And what it means is, when you tell a lie, you think, I just told a lie.
But
then
then
to cover up that lie, you have to tell another lie.
and it compounds upon itself.
Right.
And eventually, the truth is long gone.
And so there's a feeling exerted onto us by Crime and Punishment of a small evil, or in this case of a pretty large evil,
Yeah.
compounding into even larger evils through its knock-on consequences. And the story also contains a nice counterbalance to that, because there's also an idea of a small good knocking on and producing more good. When Raskolnikov decides to pay for Marmeladov's funeral, and 25 rubles is kind of a lot of money to Raskolnikov, but it's also not like a king's ransom. I think 25 rubles at the time would be equivalent to $500 or $1,000 now. A substantial amount of money, but not a fortune. But just sort of that reflexive, minor financial act of good, just saying, oh yeah, I'll pay for your father's funeral, that is the seed from which his redemption grows, from which Raskolnikov improves himself, improves the lives of his family, stands up to the story's villains and achieves victory over them in many cases, how he improves the life of Sofia Semyonova. Just as all this evil kind of grew out of this seed of this little idea that great men could do whatever they wanted, so too can an enormous amount of good grow out of the tiny seed of giving $25 to pay off a man's funeral.
I mean, it seems like, you may, obviously, I feel like this is the moral of a lot of stories, considering things happen in almost every story. But I feel like one of the main, simple 3-word theme here is just actions have consequences.
Yeah.
Crimes have punishments. But, crimes have punishments is kind of, inherently bad, but, one thing people forget is, good actions have good consequences, too.
Right.
It's we can't, one of the main themes of the book, it sounds like, is, we can't let ourselves fall into despair just because we've done bad things, even if they're pretty bad things. Because as long as we have the desire to grow and be better, we can't change the past. We can't fix what we did. At the very least, though, we can keep going and we can try to make things better for other people and for ourselves.
And with that pretty succinct wrap-up of the book, do you have any final thoughts?
Honestly, I feel like I should read this book.
I think you should. I think it's a good book.
That's gonna be our catchphrase. Every time, at the end of every episode, where one person's read a book, the other hasn't. One of us says, "Man, I should read this book."
Yeah. I do have one closing thought. Mm-hmm. So I'm not sure if this is true. I feel like I heard this or I read this somewhere, that the Russian title of this book is not the Russian words for crime and punishment. Mm-hmm. The Russian title of this book would more literally translate as The Crossing Over, which I think is a much better title, because there's kind of an idea...
it doesn't roll off the tongue as well, though.
That's true. But I do think it fits better with that idea of sort of making a small decision which leads to much larger ones.
Mm-hmm. Because, it seems like at multiple points in the book, there are points of no return.
Yeah. I think that's all we have to say. I feel like maybe I had something else to say about the title of The Crossing Over, but I don't think so. Alright, is that all?
Essentially.
So you have listened to the Read Anything Lately podcast. Today we discussed Rose Matter by Stephen King, which I don't recommend unless you have a long airplane flight coming up, in which case it's compelling enough to maybe make the landing seem a little closer. And we have discussed Crime and Punishment by Fyodor Mikhailovich Dostoevsky. Mm-hmm. Until next time, I've been Isaac.
And I've been Jason.
And this has been the Read Anything Lately podcast.
Bye.
Bye.